How do you transition out of something like that? You got any ideas? That's great. Well, we're starting a new series next week. Did you notice? It's going to be great. We're going to be talking about lots of things that could potentially cause us fear in our lives. And you've got new guides available to you today. I have one up here with me by chance. They look like this. So I want to encourage you today. Here's what we're going to do. If you're here today, if you're here in the house, take one of these with you. You can find them in the atrium. Just go there, give them your name, and you can take one for free. And after that, they're going to cost you. So it's good that you're here today. I want to welcome you. And Daybreak Live, we're glad you're here as well. And we're going to talk today about Daniel 6, where this story continues to go and where our story with this series kind of ends today. And just to give you a little preview that at the end of our time today, I'm going to be inviting you to respond. There's something that God's been doing here in our midst, and I want to invite you to come forward at the end of our time today and have a time where you might want to say to God, I want to be radical in my life. I want to be radical in my faith. We've been talking about that for the last 6 weeks now. How do we be radical in our lives and our faith? And so that's where we're going to go today. Now, I was thinking about where this story goes, and I was thinking about what Daniel models for us. And I was thinking about all the times when I've prayed most desperately, because that's what we're going to see today, is this story is really based around prayer. And I couldn't help but think of a time a few years ago when we went on vacation. We were driving out west, and we're excited. I don't know, does anybody here love road trips? I love road trips. Sometimes I think it's just way more fun than even getting on a plane. There's something about getting in a vehicle and driving and taking off. And so we got all set. Now, we had a vehicle at that point that had about 250, maybe 260,000 miles, if I remember right. And I was a little nervous about taking it across the country, so we took it to my faithful, trusty mechanic and had him, I said, I want you to look everything over, make sure everything's good. Leave no stone unturned. Look at this vehicle. Make sure that we can make it all the way out there and all the way back. So he took a week, looked the whole thing over, did a bunch of work on it, and then said, it's good. And we piled in this car and we started driving. And on our first leg of the trip, we get out to about Iowa and it starts to overheat. Now, when your vehicle overheats, in case you don't know, do not drive a vehicle that's overheating, okay? It's bad. So I thought, oh, my goodness. And so we pulled over. I think it was somewhere in Iowa. Was it in Iowa? I think so. It's kind of a blur. And it's dusk, so it's getting to be evening time, and we still got a ways to go. And so we pulled over at this truck stop. I think there was a McDonald's there, and everybody else got out and went inside, and I just sat there and just kind of panicked, what are we going to do? There's nowhere to go. I mean, to call anyone. We were just kind of stuck in the middle of the country, didn't really know what to do. And so what do you do when you get in a bind? You pray desperate prayers. I said, God, fix this vehicle. I don't know what we're going to do if this thing doesn't work. It's going to throw off our whole vacation. So I called my mechanic, who's a friend of mine. I said, what's going on? Of course, he feels bad. He was willing to drive all the way out and pick me up. And I said, well, let's see what we can do. And so he gave me a little advice. And so I let the car kind of cool down for a while and then just prayed about it. And I don't know what it was. And I was very angry that this was all happening because we were so excited about this trip. But I said, let me just pray and calm myself and take a deep breath. And then we just got in the car and started driving. I know that sounds weird, but I felt this peace about doing this. So we drove out to Colorado. We got to Colorado, everything was good. Then we decided to do something that would really test this vehicle. We drove it up to the top of Pikes Peak. You ever done that? You ever driven up at Pikes Peak? Is an intense drive. It's super high, several thousand feet in the air. And it's one of the things that really puts your vehicle to the test. Drove it up there, it was good. Drove it down, it was good. Then we kept going. Let's just keep going. So we went to Arizona. We drove to Arizona. Went to Sedona in August, by the way. Arizona, August. You get the picture? It's where you get hotter in the pool than you are outside the pool there in August. And then we went to Phoenix. I'm looking at the temperature gauge that gives the exterior temperature, and we're in Phoenix during this trip, and it got to be 120 degrees. We thought it'd be fun to roll down the window and stick our arm out. It was like a hair dryer just blowing on your arm. It was wild. But throughout that whole trip, everything was good because God answers prayer. Now, you may say, well, man, I don't have a story like that, or boy, I've asked for a lot of things and God didn't really come through for me. Well, listen, that may be the case, but that's the case for all of us. All of us have had times when something happened to us and we threw out what I might call a Hail Mary prayer. You know what I'm saying? Where you're just like, I'm just going to throw it up to God and hopefully he answers it. And all of a sudden, sometimes you get nothing. Sometimes you don't get what you want. Sometimes you get a different answer. And here's what I say about how God answers prayer. God always answers prayer. It may not be a yes. It may be a yes, it may be a no, or it may be a wait and see. But God always answers the prayers of his people. And that's what we find ourselves here. And last week, as we talked about in this story in Daniel 5, something very significant happened when Daniel gave this word to King Belshazzar. We just get a little bit of a glimpse of who he was in Daniel 5. And then that chapter of Babylon ends, and the Medes and the Persians come in, and we find a new king. New management. Daniel's still in Babylon. But in Daniel chapter 6, we're going to start and think about what is happening here in this story. So, it pleased Darius, who at this point was the king of Babylon, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel was so distinguished himself amongst the administrators and the satraps by exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the entire kingdom. You see his favor here. It continues to happen. So at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. Now stop here just for a second. Hold your place there. They're jealous. They see how Daniel is becoming promoted, and they're jealous, and so they try to set a trap for him. But here it says they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." That says so much about Daniel's character right there. And here's what happens is from there, if you listen to Griff when Griff was doing his riff up here earlier, which was amazing, and he kind of gave us a preview of this story. I don't know if you caught it, but they were jealous. This is all what he just did. And so they said, we're going to create this law. We're going to make ourselves look good before King Darius, and we're going to get Darius to agree that no one can pray for 30 days to anyone except to the king himself. Now, this was a common thing. And in fact, this still exists in our world today, that some people are looked upon, especially in leadership in other parts of the country, as divine, as God among us. And so this was kind of the deal back then. And so they set up this law. Then we find this in verse 10. So when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, this was the decree that you couldn't pray to anyone for 30 days except for Darius, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. These men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and they spoke to him about his royal decree. So they're reminding the king here, hey, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? That was the trap there. And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Wow, here we go. Here we go. So Daniel, when he immediately finds out about this decree, what does he do? He does something that he always did. he prayed. And we find that because of their jealousy, that he faced the consequences of doing the right thing. Now, a lot of times when we think about consequences, we go, well, I'm going to get the consequences of my actions. But a lot of times we think, well, if I do something wrong, then I'll get the consequences. But what about when we do something right and you get the consequences of it? What about if you're just doing what you should be doing? In fact, you do something above and beyond. And you do something maybe even as a declaration of your faith in this world, and you're trying to do the right thing, and then things go in reverse. This is what's happening with Daniel here. He's doing the right thing, and now all of a sudden, he's getting this pushback against him. I find it interesting. Now, in my life, I've faced a lot of consequences for doing the wrong thing. A lot of consequences. In fact, I was thinking about that. I almost didn't graduate from college. I'm going to tell you this now because you already voted me in as your pastor. I almost didn't graduate from college on time because I pulled a prank the last week I was in college. You probably haven't heard about this, have you? Okay, good. I decided it would be a good idea to go into the library with some friends in the middle of the night and pull down about 60,000 books and pull them down on their spines all through the library. Thought that would be funny. And I thought it was kind of funny. President didn't think it was so funny. And so the week before, I want you to picture, you're getting ready to graduate college. You're getting ready to become a pastor. And you got to meet with the president, and your diploma's sitting on his desk when you walk in there. It's a little nervous, I'm going to tell you, but I made it. I'm good. Everything worked out. Got my degree. I'm okay. Done lots of things in my life where I've had consequences for doing the wrong thing. But when you do the right thing, it's like life goes backwards. It's like, God, what's the deal? I'm doing this and I'm doing the right thing, and now all of a sudden I'm going backwards. And let me remind you that a lot of times, especially if you're newer to your commitment to Christ, we've had lots of people over the last 3 or 4 weeks give their lives to Christ. You know, we track that around here. You know, we've had over 30 people give their lives to Christ here in the last month or so. That's incredible. And so if you're one of those people, if you're newer to this thing and you're trying to figure out, and you may think, okay, it's exciting, it's great, I made this decision, but Jeff, let me be honest with you, my life really has gotten worse since this happened. You know, that's a typical thing, by the way, that when you start doing the right things, things can all of a sudden feel like they're going backwards, and you go, hey, is this working? Is this real? Is this right? Did I do the right thing? Or, boy, it'd be easier, Jeff, to just go right back to my old life. But let me remind you that sometimes you will face consequences when you do the right thing. That's okay. It's part of a plan that God's working in your behalf, because God's always working ahead of you on your behalf, by the way. So it said that Daniel, when this happened, he heard about the decree, and then he went up to his room, and there's a few key things to note here. That it said that he went, and how many times a day, just tell me out loud if you're in the room here, how many times a day was Daniel praying at that time? 3. You caught it, 3 times, okay? So Daniel had this routine. He had this routine in his life where 3 times a day he prayed. And he did this on a regular, continual basis. Now, by the way, this is one of the more well-known stories in the Bible that we're looking at. And there's been a few of these well-known stories. And if you noticed a few weeks ago when we looked at Daniel 3, where they were bowing down before the gold statue, and those 3 Hebrew young men stood up for what was right, and we didn't even go into the part of the story where they were thrown into the blazing furnace, which is the more well-known part of the story. And today, just to give you a heads up, we're not even going to go into the part where he's thrown into the lion's den. Because I almost feel like it's the Titanic. You know, if you never seen the movie Titanic, you know how it ends, right? Well, a lot of people know Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and that's an incredible part of the story. If you don't know it, and if you haven't already, read through Daniel 6. But I just think the part of the story that stands out to me is this routine that Daniel had. Now, when you think about what prayer is, I don't know what your definition would be. I'd be curious to sit down with many of you and say, what would you say is your definition of prayer? Because prayer is something I've studied and really thought about a lot and practiced my whole life. But over the last 10 or 11 years specifically, I've really taken a deep dive into what prayer is. And I will tell you that prayer is the most incredible gift. It's so much more all-encompassing than I ever imagined. And yet I have a hard time defining what it really is, because prayer is so many things. And what I found for myself is that God has continued to enlarge my box of what prayer really is. I used to think growing up that prayer was something I did before I went to bed and then before I ate meals. That was the routine I was kind of given from my parents. So every time we ate a meal, you would never eat a meal in the Eckert household without saying a prayer. So we said a prayer all the time. I remember when I became really passionate about my faith going into my freshman year of high school. I remember thinking, I need to start praying at school. And so I'm like, I eat lunch. I ate at the rowdy table. Like, we were always the troublemakers. And I'm like, I'm going to pray. And so I tried to do it as quick and, like not being seen as much as possible. So I did this little thing a lot of times where I'd do like a drop the napkin prayer. I'd just drop the napkin, reach out again, thank you for this food, amen. And I remember one time just kind of sitting there, and I was like, I need to be a little bit more bold. And so I was a shy kid, but I just sat there one day and bowed my head, sat there for a few seconds. Then I opened my eyes and I looked around, and everyone at my table was staring at me. Eckert, what are you doing? I was like, I'm praying. And from then on, it just became a joke. They made fun of me every day. So it just kind of became this joke, but it was a routine I grew up with. My dad every night would come in and he taught me that now I lay me down to sleep prayers. Anybody know that prayer? Anybody here by chance pray that prayer when you're a kid? Now I lay me down to sleep? A lot of you. So the way it goes is, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. So imagine I'm just this little scruffy-haired kid, innocent. So pray the Lord my soul to keep. And then this prayer takes a really dark turn, if you know this prayer. If I should die before I wake. And I found myself just like thinking about death all the time. What if I die tonight? So it's like, if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. All right, see you later. And that was it. It's like, all right, thanks, Dad, for leaving me with the thought of death every night. That's great. That was my routine. My routine was before meal, before bed. Daniel here, it's different. There's a routine in his life. And I don't know what your routine is, but let me challenge, encourage you, no matter where you are in your faith journey, is to have a routine, is to have something you can do. When I drive here to Daybreak, many, many times, it's a routine. And it's a habit, it's a discipline. I'll turn off any noise and I'll just pray for you. I pray that God would just have his way over us. And I think about many of you and knowing your stories and what's happening. I'll pray for you. Pray for our elders and our staff. Pray for people by name. Asking that God would shower his blessing over you. But as I talk to you about prayer, I will tell you my definition of prayer continues to evolve. And here's my current definition of what I think prayer is. I think prayer is recognizing and responding to the reality and the presence of God in our lives. I think when we recognize him and then we respond to him. See, what I've found with prayer is that prayer really doesn't begin and end with me. Prayer really begins and ends with God. And so prayer is me entering into this conversation that God's already started. A lot of times I would think, well, when I pray, I'll just start praying and that's when prayer starts. But it's so much bigger than that. And here's Daniel with this routine, recognizing and responding to God and his presence and his reality in his life there in Babylon. Now, you'll find it's really interesting, the other part of the story. You remember it says that he opened his windows to Jerusalem. I want you to think about what that means. He opened the windows of Jerusalem. So it says he faced Jerusalem when he prayed. So when Daniel went up into this house 3 times a day and opened his windows, he faced Jerusalem. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because that's not just a detail that doesn't matter. That's something that really, really matters in a very, very important way in this story. So, if you remember, way back at the beginning of this story, Daniel was in Jerusalem. That's where he lived. That's where he grew up. And Babylon comes in and conquers them. And you're going to see on the map here, within Jerusalem, he was surrounded by the country of Judah. It was part of Israel at that time. Israel was kind of split into 2 parts. And there's Judah, and Jerusalem's right there, the capital city. That's where Daniel lived. Babylon comes in, and they capture him, and they take him away. So he's in Babylon. He's in a foreign country. And yet he finds himself opening his windows and facing west toward Jerusalem. Why? Why did he do that? There's so much here for us to understand. See, Daniel was in a place where he could have thought, it's over, we've been conquered, I've lived here. By the way, Daniel's an old man at this point. He has spent his entire life pretty much in Babylon as a captive. So he's facing Jerusalem. And as he's facing Jerusalem, we don't find this necessarily in the text, but I'm going to tell you what I believe. I believe this helps us understand that Daniel was praying forward. Daniel was praying with hope. Daniel was praying with anticipation that one day this captivity of God's people would be over. And that can help us so much today. Because if there's one theme I hear over and over with people, is they say, Jeff, it's over. What God is doing in America is over. Our best days are behind us. Jeff, when I look at the next generation, I just feel so hopeless. They're so lost. They're dead. Jeff, the church is dying. Jeff, faith is struggling so much. And I'm going to tell you, that is not of God. That mindset and mentality is not what God would want you to have. That when you pray forward. You pray with anticipation. You pray with hope. You pray with faith. You pray with belief. You pray towards something. Because I believe as Daniel was praying and facing Jerusalem, there was a hope that was rising in him saying, days ahead will change. And let me tell you, God is not done with this world. God is not done with you. He's not done with Daybreak, our community, our nation, our world. God is on the move. We were last night, late into the night, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, just to go down and see what God was doing as this group of young people are traveling around the country. And they're praying, and people are coming to Christ. A ministry called Gen Z for Jesus. We were there just last night. God is moving. God is not done. So when you pray with anticipation, you pray with hope, you pray with faith, you pray with belief. Because there's so many, it's overwhelming. There's so many things that God says to us about prayer. There's so many things that Jesus tells us in his teachings about what we are to think, that God is our Father, that he loves us, that he is in favor for us, that he is for us, that he is working on our behalf, that all things are working together for us on our behalf. For God's power to be moving ahead. It's an unstoppable force. And that's what we do when we pray. There's so many things to think about. And I think about students that I know across the country over the years that have prayed for Claim Your Campus. This ministry that we're a part of, it Never the Same. And there's a story I want you to see about a group of students that got together and they began to pray for their school. And here's their story.
Well, before CYC, prayer was like, okay, well, I know I have to do this. It's like read the Bible, pray, and go to church.
On the app, it gives you a couple things to fill out that ask you, like, what are some problems that you immediately want to begin praying for in your school. We checked academics, violence, and more bold Christ followers.
Marion High School has kind of had like a bad reputation for being a dangerous or violent school, just because we're known for like having lots of fights.
When I got here, we were averaging probably a fight every few days. Kids were thinking that fighting was okay. They had been an F school for many, many years.
Well, you know, like in theory that God moves through prayer and stuff like that, but it's not really like that you sit back and are like, oh yeah, when we start this, he's gonna do this. Like even as we were praying for like the fighting thing, we just kind of didn't really notice like any change at first. But then it was like after months had passed, we just kind of sat and looked back and like, wait a second, I haven't seen a fight happen in I can't even remember when. Like a big thing just happened, and it came from our prayer. Then Amante was like, yeah, it's like the principal just told me that all the teachers are saying that all of our grades have been going up, and that on our ISTEP state testing scores, our class got us up to an A school.
Our data now, we've had 2 fights this school year. We last year had 26 out of 27 of our students pass the AP Calculus test. That's one of the top 5 scores in the country. Our last year's senior class earned over 4,000 credits in college. And in a place where we're economically depressed right now, we want to give parents every opportunity to save every penny they can. And it's not an accident. I mean, God works miracles in places. If I was to talk to another school and tell them the impact the CYC prayer group has had on our school, I would tell them it's been nothing but short of extraordinary. Students caring for each other, students praying for each other, and students doing everything they can to show Christ's love to each other. Again, what school would not want that in their district? Whether it's public or private, makes no difference. Student-led prayer is okay, because it's a great opportunity for students to lead in a positive way.
Oh, man. That gets me fired up. Let me introduce you, in case you don't know this young lady. This is, of all my 3 daughters, this is one of my favorites. This is Sophia, and she's in high school. And Sophia, you were part of a tour this summer called the Enlighten Tour. And you traveled throughout the United States. Tell everyone a little bit about what you did when you would stop at these places and what the Enlighten Tour did.
Yeah, so I was part of the Enlightened Students team, and students around the country decided that they wanted to lead an Enlightened event in their schools, which meant a student-led worship night in their high schools. So we as our team, we kind of just helped orchestrate that, and we kind of led them into what they needed to do and what they needed for resources.
So students leading students, isn't that incredible? And you saw lots of really cool things. What are some of the things that happened as you guys were traveling around on the tour?
We just saw a lot of passion in these students. They really were passionate about what they wanted to do, and we saw God move in really good ways. Every time that we had an event, 2 of our students specifically would walk around the track fields outside where we were, and they would pray. And I would say at those events where we prayed the most extraordinary things happened.
That's amazing. And between your mom or your dad, who's your favorite? Just for the record here. Go ahead.
No, I'm not going to say.
I tried. Too political. Okay, this is Eric. And Eric, you're in 7th grade. And recently you learned this year what See at the Pole is. And you can see some pictures up here, by the way. So Eric, what happened for See at the Pole this year at your school, at Allendale Middle School?
We all of us got to school early, and we went to the flagpole, and we probably had around 45 kids pray on the flagpole, and we had 8th and 7th graders, and like one or two 6th graders.
Cool. So you organized this. That's a picture you'll see right up there. And then out of that, you started something every week during lunch, like a Bible study. And what's happening with that right now? It's still going. So what's going on with the Bible study?
So when we started the Bible study, we started just like it was right after See at the Pole, and it was on a Thursday, and we started doing it just to try it out, and we really liked it. So on Mondays and Wednesdays we meet, and we have discussion and talk about God. And then this week we actually start Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then we have about 40 kids in our group, and 8th grade started their one, and they have about 60.
So isn't that cool? So I was thinking about that, and I asked Eric, how many students go to your school between 7th and 8th grade? It's about 400 or so, at least according to what we think. So I don't know if you caught that. 40 students in 7th grade every day in the cafeteria or throughout the week, and then 60 8th graders. So about 100 students. So 100 out of 400 students are gathering now because Eric caught a vision and something you've never done before, but to do this thing called See at the Pole. And so when we're talking about being radical, that's what I love. We've told great stories of all ages, but these two young people right here are radical for their faith. And can we thank them for being so? Thank you, guys. Good stuff. Thank you. Wow, it's just amazing what God's doing. And when we pray, things begin to happen. And what we see in these students and what we're seeing around the country right now is people are getting desperate, and that's good. And in this case, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and God shut the mouths of those lions. And then listen to what happens next. In verse 25, it says this: So King Darius wrote all the nations of the peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You see what happens here when you begin to pray, when you begin to be radical, when you begin to really put yourself out there for your faith? God will respond and he'll give you favor. You may feel like it's a setback for a while. You may feel like, things are going backwards, but trust me and trust his word in this story here by knowing that God will be moving you forward as you choose to be radical for him. I was just thinking about this series and what it's spoken to many of us, and I want to be specific here for a minute. And I want you to think about each chapter in this story for a second. And I want you to think to yourself, would you like to see God do something through your life because you're radical in your faith? In chapter 1, we see Daniel right at the beginning in verse 8 leading the way, choosing not to defile himself like everyone around him. And maybe God is speaking to you and saying, I want to be radical in how I lead for God. For some of you, it might be seeing God do the impossible. You need something right now for God to do that only he can do. And you want to be radical and see God do that. Maybe for you, it's standing up for what's right. Maybe for you, I've been kind of following the ways of the world and bowing down, but I need to stand before God. Maybe it's in caring for the oppressed. God spoke to the king, and he said to Nebuchadnezzar, you need to care for people on the margins. And maybe God really spoke to you about that when we read that in our guides and when you were listening to that part of the series. Maybe for you, it's listening and knowing that you can live for a greater purpose. Last week we talked about that our lives can serve a common purpose or they can serve a greater purpose. And maybe for you, you want to pray in a radical way for the world around you. And here's what I'd like you to consider here for a moment. I'm going to invite you as we sing, and if you're here in the house, here's how it's going to work. I'm going to invite you to come forward and just stand or kneel along the front. We haven't done this in a long time. But it's a way of you saying before God, I want to be radical. And maybe one of these specific ways is how I want God to move in my life. I want my life to count. I want my life to make a difference. And if you're watching on Daybreak Live, I want you to interact with us right now. We've got people there, and we want to hear how God's moving in your life. And signify for us a way that you want to respond during these moments now as well. As we think about where we are in our world, we need some radical people out there. We need people that are willing to put themselves out there for their faith. And so maybe this is new for you and you're like, oh, Jeff, this is kind of crazy. I've never done that. We're not going to ask you to speak in front of the church. You're just coming up to pray. And we've got prayer partners here too in our church that they may come up and put a hand on your shoulder just to pray for you in support of a response today. Because we can't just sit and listen to these teachings and then just walk away unchanged. We need to step forward in faith. And I think this is an important moment for us right now. So I'm going to invite you to stand here in the house. And as we begin to sing this song, I want to invite you, if this is a prayer for you, you want to be radical, I just want to invite you to come along the front and let's have some time where we'll just spend with him, and then I'll wrap up that time in prayer. You respond as God leads you.